She used to think that if she was good enough, quiet enough, grateful enough, it would all work out. That was the lie she carried for 29 years, folded up small and tucked somewhere beneath her ribs, right next to everything else she was never allowed to say out loud. Her name was Brianna, and the story of how she lost herself and found her way back began not with a slap, not with a door slamming shut, but with a letter she wasn't supposed to find. She'd been cleaning out the hall closet in her childhood home, the kind of task her mother Miriam assigned whenever she wanted Brianna nearby without having to admit she missed her. It was a Saturday in late October. The smell of her mother's cooking, red beans, cornbread, drifted through the house, and for a few hours Brianna felt like a child again, small and safe, before she understood what home actually cost her. The letter was in a shoebox behind a stack of her father's old tax files. Brianna almost missed it. It was sealed, stamped, but never mailed. Her name was on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it anyway. It was from a woman named Eloise, her father's sister. An Aunt Brianna had been told died before she was born. Eloise was not dead. Eloise had written to say that she was thinking of Brianna, that she had been thinking of her for years, that she prayed the girl had grown up knowing how loved she was, not just by her parents, but by the whole family that her father, Curtis, had decided she would never know. Brianna stood in that closet for a long time. Long enough for the cornbread to burn a little at the edges. Long enough for Miriam to call her name twice from the kitchen. She folded the letter carefully, the way you fold something that might break if you're not gentle with it, and she slipped it into the pocket of her jeans. She didn't say a word at dinner. She listened to her father talk about his co-worker's retirement party, watched her mother refill his glass without being asked, and she smiled when it seemed like she was supposed to smile. That night, alone in the guest bedroom that still had her old volleyball trophies on the shelf, she read the letter 4 more times. She thought about all the Christmases she'd spent in that house, wondering why they never visited family. All the times she'd asked her father about his side of the family, and he'd said there wasn't much to tell. She thought about how easily she had believed him. Curtis Holloway was the kind of man who didn't raise his voice often. So when he did, the whole room rearranged itself around his anger. He was a deacon at their church. He coached Little League for 10 years. People in their town, a close-knit community outside of Savannah, Georgia, spoke about him the way people speak about monuments. Solid, dependable, unquestionable. Brianna had spent her whole life trying not to question him either. She was 31 now, working as a pediatric occupational therapist at a clinic 2 towns over, renting a modest apartment she'd decorated with plants she kept mostly alive and framed prints she'd picked herself. She had built something small but entirely her own. And yet, every time she came home, she shrank. She became 17 again, waiting to be told whether her choices were acceptable. She drove back to her apartment the next morning without saying goodbye to her parents, which she had never done in her life. She sat with her coffee and looked at Eloise's address, printed neatly at the top of the letter. Then she picked up her phone. Eloise answered on the second ring. She had a warm voice, a little gravelly, the voice of someone who had lived long enough to stop softening things unnecessarily. She wasn't surprised to hear from Brianna. She said she had been half expecting this call for years. What Eloise told her over the next hour rearranged everything. Brianna thought she knew about her own life. Brianna's grandfather, her father's father, had died 8 years ago and left behind a modest estate. Not enormous wealth, but enough. A house in Charleston, some savings, a piece of land. He had divided it equally among his children in his will, which included Curtis and Eloise and 2 others. Curtis's share had been held in a trust, but there was a separate provision, a smaller account specifically designated for any grandchildren who were pursuing careers in healthcare or education. Brianna, who had been working in pediatric therapy for 6 years by then, qualified exactly. No one had told her. Her father had never mentioned the inheritance, the grandfather she'd barely been allowed to know, or the trust that had her name on it. Eloise said, gently but plainly, that Curtis had always controlled the family the way he controlled everything else. He didn't like people knowing things he hadn't chosen to share. I hadn't told Brianna about the inheritance because doing so would have meant admitting that her grandfathers existed as a full person, a man with a will and wishes of his own, rather than as a distant, irrelevant figure in a story Curtis was always the center of. Brianna didn't cry on the phone. She was too stunned for tears. She thanked Eloise and wrote down the name of the attorney who had handled the estate. She sat very still after she hung up, looking at the spider plant on her windowsill, and she thought about the security deposit she'd had to borrow from her parents when she moved into her first apartment. She thought about how her father had held that over her for 2 years. She thought about the car she'd wanted to buy when she was 25. A used Subaru, nothing fancy. And how her father had told her it was a bad investment and steered her toward the sedan he thought was more practical. And how she had listened, because she always listened, because disagreeing with Curtis felt like trying to push against a wall that would never move. She thought about what it meant that all this time, she had been told she had nothing, and no one on her father's side, when the truth was she'd had family and resources she'd been quietly kept from. That Wednesday, Brianna called in a personal day and drove to the attorney's office in Charleston. The paralegal was kind and thorough. The account existed. It hadn't been touched. With accumulated interest, it was more than Brianna had expected. Not life-changing wealth, but enough to pay off her student loans and have money left over. Enough to give her the kind of ground beneath her feet that she hadn't realized she was missing. She signed the paperwork. She drove home in a kind of silence that felt different from the silence she usually carried. Not the silence of suppression, but of something settling. She did not call her father that evening. For the first time in her adult life, she simply did not. Her mother called on Thursday. Miriam had a way of making check-in calls feel like inspections, warm on the surface, probing underneath. She asked about Brianna's week, her work, whether she'd been eating enough. Brianna answered simply, without volunteering the thing that was sitting in the center of every thought she had. "Your father was asking about you," Miriam said. "I'm sure he was," Brianna said. There was a pause on the line. Her mother didn't know what to do with a sentence that wasn't an apology or an explanation. "Are you all right, baby?" "I'm fine, Mom." She wasn't, exactly. But she also wasn't the kind of not fine she used to be. The quiet, grinding, low-grade not fine of a woman who had been taught that her instincts were something to be managed rather than listened to. This was a different feeling. Clarifying, almost. Like the moment when the fog lifts and you realize you've been standing somewhere you don't want to stand. She waited 2 more weeks before she confronted her father. She had rehearsed it. She'd practiced in her car, speaking aloud to no one, laying out the facts calmly and clearly. She knew her father. She knew that if she cried or wavered or gave him any opening to reframe the conversation as being about her emotional state, he would take it. So she arrived at her parents' house on a Sunday, after church, when the afternoon was slow, and Miriam had gone to her sister's for a few hours, and she sat across from Curtis at the kitchen table with the letter from Eloise and the documentation from the attorney laid out in front of her. She told him what she knew. She watched his face go through several things: surprise, quickly controlled. Then something that looked briefly like shame, just as quickly closed off. Then the particular hardening that meant she had crossed into territory he would not allow. He told her she had no idea what she was talking about. He told her that Eloise had always been a troublemaker, always tried to pit family members against each other. He said the inheritance situation was complicated and that he had been planning to discuss it with Brianna when the time was right. He said that everything he had ever done had been for her benefit, that she had never lacked for anything, that she was sitting in his kitchen showing him documents she had gone behind his back to retrieve, and that he was disappointed in her. That word, disappointed. She had flinched at that word her whole life. It had worked on her like a physical thing, a hand at the back of the neck pressing down. It didn't work this time. She said, very quietly, "You kept me from my grandfather's family. You kept money that was meant for me. And you want to talk about disappointment." Curtis stood up. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose physical presence had always felt like a form of punctuation, the period at the end of every argument. He pointed at her and told her she needed to lower her voice and show some respect. "I am showing you exactly as much respect as this conversation deserves," Brianna said. "Which means I'm still here. I haven't left. I'm looking at you and talking to you like an adult, which is all I have ever wanted you to do for me." He told her she was being influenced by a woman she'd spoken to once on the phone. He told her that Eloise had her own agenda. He said that Brianna had always been too sensitive, too quick to take things personally, that this was exactly why he'd always worried about her. She gathered her papers. She put them back in the folder. She stood up and pushed in her chair the way her mother had always insisted on, a small domestic reflex she couldn't seem to stop even now. "I'm not asking for an apology today," she said. "I'm telling you that I know, and that I'm done pretending I don't." She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard him say her name once, not a plea, not quite, but something more uncertain than his usual authority. She didn't turn around. She sat in her car in the driveway for a few minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing slowly. Then she drove home. She expected to feel worse. She had braced herself for the particular kind of devastation that follows confronting someone you love with the truth about what they've done. But what she actually felt, sitting in her apartment that evening with a cup of tea, and her cat pushing his head against her ankle, was something she took a while to name: relief. Not because the situation was resolved, it wasn't. Not because her father had owned up to anything, he hadn't. But because she had said the true thing out loud in a room where it mattered, and the walls hadn't fallen, and she was still herself on the other side of it. Her mother called the next morning. Brianna answered, braced. Miriam was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He told me what you said. I imagine he did." "Brianna." Her mother's voice was tired. "Your father has not always." She stopped. Started again. "He grew up in a house where the men made decisions and everyone else fell in line. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying he doesn't know another way. He's 70 years old, Mom." At some point, not knowing another way is a choice. Another silence. "I know," Miriam said finally. So quietly, Brianna almost missed it. That was the moment she understood that her mother had known. Maybe not about the inheritance specifically, but about the pattern of it. The way Curtis moved through the world like gravity, pulling everything toward him, determining what orbited where. Miriam had survived that by becoming very still. It was not a strategy Brianna was able to admire, but standing there in her kitchen, 31 years old, she found she could understand it without approving of it. "I love you, Mom," Brianna said. "But I can't keep pretending things are fine when they aren't." "I know," Miriam said again. They hung up without resolving anything. That felt true, too. The weeks that followed were uncomfortable in the way that real changes always are. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the slow, itchy work of renegotiating a relationship, without anyone else agreeing to renegotiate. Her father did not call her. She did not call him. She heard through Miriam that he was telling people she was going through something, that she had gotten some ideas in her head, that he was praying for her. She let that be what it was. What she focused on instead was the life that was quietly expanding around her. She reached out to Eloise properly, and they began talking every week. Long, wandering conversations about the family Brianna had missed, the cousins she'd never met, her grandfather's garden in Charleston, the recipe for his sweet potato pie that Eloise still made every Thanksgiving. She learned that she looked like her grandmother. She learned that her grandfather had been a school teacher who believed in public libraries and kept a notebook of every book he read. She learned that there were people in the world who were connected to her by blood and history, and who had simply been waiting all this time to know her. She also, around this time, met someone. His name was Miles. He was a physical therapist who worked at a clinic affiliated with hers, and they had crossed paths a few times at a case coordination meeting, without it meaning anything in particular. Then one afternoon, he held a door for her in the parking lot and said something genuinely funny. Not performatively funny, but the kind of funny that comes from noticing something real about the world, and she laughed, and he looked pleased in a way that wasn't self-congratulatory, and that was how it started. Miles was quiet in the way that had substance to it. He asked questions and listened to the actual answers. He had a mother he was close to, and a younger brother he helped out regularly, and opinions about things that were consistent, regardless of who was in the rooms. Brianna, who had learned over years of knowing the wrong men that charm was sometimes just control wearing a better outfit, watched him carefully in the beginning. She waited for the version of him that appeared when he wasn't trying to impress anyone. That version turned out to be the same version. Steady, thoughtful, present. She told him, a few months in, about her father and the letter and all of it. She told him plainly, without dressing it up or minimizing it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't try to fix it or offer a take on what her father must have been thinking. He just said that he was glad she found out, and that he was glad she'd had the courage to say something. "A lot of people don't," he said. "I know," she said. "I almost didn't." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers just briefly. It was such a small thing. She had been touched by men before in ways that were supposed to mean something and didn't. This was different in the opposite direction, small, and meaning everything. Her father reached out 7 months after their confrontation. Not an apology, she hadn't expected one, had stopped expecting one, but a request. He wanted to have dinner. He said he missed her. She thought about it for several days. She talked to Eloise, who said simply, "You'll know what's right for you." She talked to Miles, who said he'd support whatever she decided. She thought about what she wanted, and whether there was anything left between her and her father that was worth the discomfort of trying to find it. She went to dinner. It was not a reconciliation in any tidy sense. Her father did not confess. He didn't say, "I kept things from you and I'm sorry, and here's why." What he said was that he had been thinking about the future, about getting older, about wanting his family close. He said he knew she was upset. He said he hoped she could find a way to move past it. Brianna looked at him across the restaurant table, this man she had spent her whole life trying to satisfy, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, tired. Tired in a clean way, the way you're tired after finishing something difficult, not the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying something that never ends. She said, "I'm not upset anymore, Dad. I'm just clear." He looked at her like he didn't understand what that meant. Maybe. He didn't. She said, "I'll be around. I want to have a relationship with you and Mom, but it's going to be different than it's been. I'm not going to pretend things are what they're not, and I'm not going to make myself smaller so things are more comfortable." He didn't respond to that directly. He talked about her work, asked a few polite questions about her apartment. He was cautious with her in a way she'd never experienced him being cautious with anyone. She wasn't sure if that was growth or just recalibration. She decided it didn't have to be one or the other yet. She drove home and called Eloise, and then Miles, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that her life was hers in a way that was real rather than just technically true. She went to Charleston for Thanksgiving that year. Eloise made the sweet potato pie. There were cousins Brianna recognized from photographs and some she'd never seen. Someone put on music, and an older uncle told a story about her grandfather that made the whole room laugh. She sat at a table surrounded by people who shared her blood, people who had been real and present, and waiting for her this whole time, and she thought about the shoebox in the closet, the letter she'd almost missed. She thought about what her life might have been if she'd put it back. If she'd smoothed it down and gone to dinner and never asked a single question. She could have. She had the muscle memory for it. It would have been easy, in the way that continuing to do a thing is always easier than stopping. She was glad she hadn't. Miles came for Christmas. He fit easily into the new world she was building, met Eloise, played cards with the cousins, charmed her mother without even trying because he was just, simply, himself. He and her father shook hands and were politely careful with each other, the way men are, when they both understand that a woman they care about is watching. On New Year's Eve, just the two of them on her apartment balcony, listening to distant fireworks somewhere across the city, Miles told her he loved her. She didn't perform surprise. She looked at him clearly and said she loved him too, and meant it in a way that felt nothing like the desperate, hopeful love she had offered other people in other years. Love as audition. Love as proof. This felt like something different. Like choosing. Brianna Holloway, at 31 years old, had a family she hadn't known she had. A man who didn't require her to be less than she was. Money in a bank account that had always been hers. And the knowledge, not the belief. The knowledge that she was capable of standing in a difficult room and telling truth and walking out the other side still intact. She still talked to her father. Some. It was not easy. It was not what she would have chosen if she could have chosen how the whole story went. But she had stopped waiting for him to give her something he had never known how to give. And in that space, the space where the waiting used to live, she had put things that were actually hers. That was enough. Not everything, but enough. And she had learned, finally, that knowing the difference was its own kind of freedom.